Well, hello. It is week one. We're in module one for our class on church finance and budgeting. And each week, as a part of this class, we're going to be talking about some stewardship principles, some biblical understanding of how to handle money and finances and budgeting. We're going to look at that through the teachings of Jesus. And so today we're going to look at one of his parables in Luke chapter 12. And so I hope you've got a Bible with you. If you don't, go ahead and pause the video, go grab a Bible or open up a window from Bible Gateway there on your computer or on your phone or somewhere to read along. And here's the kind of the guiding principle behind why we're doing this. Why we're going to look at what will often appear to be personal instruction about budget and finance. And the reason for that is because as we look at what it means to be faithful with what it means to be faithful with our church's finances, with our church's budget, as we look at that, what we have to understand is that many of the principles that go along with church finance and budgeting, while there are unique aspects of it, the principles behind them are the same principles that we would have for our personal budgeting, for our personal finance, for our personal stewardship. That's why this first week, we're just talking about biblical stewardship, trying to get an overview of that. Hearing a sermon about that from Tony Evans, reading about that in our book, right? Now, again, we'll have those moments where there's some specific issues. The interview with Bill Towns this week does that. But what I want to do is look through Jesus' teaching on handling money, about possessions, about material things, and then ask ourselves the question, how does that apply to us individually, but also how does that apply to churches? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get to a place where we have some notes for you that you can take and be a part of. All right. And so we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 12. And as I was reading some of this, the parable of the rich fool, I thought about a show that used to be, I think it was on A&E years ago, called Hoarders. And maybe you've watched Hoarders, maybe you haven't, maybe you have heard about it, but it was a show that would basically follow people who could not get rid of things. And as they went into it, there were always two people that came along to help. One was an organizer, somebody that came in and said, we have to throw away, we have to move, we have to sell, we have to organize all of this stuff, and we have to do that in a systematic way. But they would always bring in after that, not just the organizer that would tell people how to get it through, they would bring in a psychologist who would help them understand why they were doing what they were doing, why they were having to keep all of this stuff, why they were consistently keeping more and more stuff and weren't able to rid themselves of it. And so the show demonstrated that greed, that our desire for stuff, our materialism, is not ultimately about our possessions at all, but it's about something inside of us that we are thirsting for, that we are longing after. Jesus is going to speak to that fallen condition in Luke chapter 12. And so we're going to look through this. We're going to walk through it. We're going to talk about some symptoms that we may have as a society and as individuals, and then ways that God intends for us to use our money, use our possessions, use our finances. So let's look at Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. It says, someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Scholars say this was a problem that older brothers would oftentimes kind of swindle their younger siblings, younger brothers. Only brothers were allowed inheritance, out of inheritance, up to, they would take up to 2/3, 3/4, and kind of swindle their brothers out of the rest of their inheritance. And so this was a common problem, and probably was one of the things where he had a right to say, hey, I'm not able to get my inheritance. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Friend," he said in verse 14, "who appointed me as a judge and arbiter over you?" He then told them, "Watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions." Then he told him a parable. Now we're going to stop right there for just a moment. We'll get this picture off the screen of the hoarder. All right. And so Jesus hears this man's request. And then he asked him, a question back and says, I am not the judge in this case. I am not the authority here that be able to give you an official ruling. But what I am going to tell you is that we need to be on guard against greed. He speaks to the younger brother He doesn't go to the older brother and say, hey, go get your manipulating older brother. Let's figure this out. He doesn't say to him, hey, listen, it's wrong for him to do that. I agree. He's taking advantage of you. Let me have at him a little bit. He speaks to the younger brother. And that's because it's possible to be right and still be consumed by something that's wrong. And this younger brother, according to Jesus, had to be careful because greed was creeping into his life. And so the lesson, if you want an overall lesson for this particular parable, for this section that we're going to talk about, we'll talk about some implications of this in a little bit, is that all of us need to be on guard against greed. Now, that's in our personal finances, that's in our personal budgeting. We need to be on guard against greed. But that's also when it comes to church budgeting and finance. One of the things that we have to guard against is making the church a profitable business that we're trying to run in a way that brings lots of financial windfall. If you're on staff in a church, you have to resist the temptation to think about how much money you're making, how much you need to make, how much you want to make, and thinking of the church as something that can be a place where you can make lots of money. You got to be careful about how you handle the church's finances, about investments, about where we put the money, how we spend the money. And again, at every step of the way, it may seem weird to even talk about this with a church, but we have to be in a place where we guard our hearts against greed. Greed is a problem in America. And there are some statistics that help us to figure that out. For instance, I don't know if you knew this or not, but Americans make on average 4 times compared to more than the average person outside of America. So if you take all the rest of the world except for America, and you take American, the average American makes 4 times the average other world citizen. And so we ought to be the best financial shape. And we are in a lot of ways, except we don't spend that money wisely. In fact, Americans spend 98% of their money on themselves. We'll look in a minute. That's not even including like savings, because we don't do a whole lot of savings in America. We don't give like we used to. In fact, Americans give less to charity today, percentage-wise, that is the percentage of our income, than they did during the Great Depression. So people in the Great Depression gave higher percentage of their income away to charitable contributions to church and other charities than the average American does today. Americans spend more than they make. The average American spends $1.26 for every dollar they spend. Well, how do they do it for every dollar they earn? How do they do that? Well, they rack up credit card. They spend more than they have. They live above their means. They're more concerned about what they appear to have than what they're actually able to afford. And so that's an important thing for us to see. So you just look at those statistics, 4 times the rest of the world, and yet we spend 98% of it on ourselves. We give less than they did in the Great Depression, and we spend $1.26 more over $1.26 when every dollar that we make. You realize pretty quickly that we have a problem in this country with desiring, paying for, taking possessions and money too seriously. And so as we hear that, as we hear to be on guard against greed, listen to the parable that he told them. This is chapter 12, verse 16. Then he told them a parable. A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself, is not rich towards God. That's how it is for those that store up treasures for themselves and are not rich towards God. Then he says to the disciples, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about the body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They don't have a storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than the birds? And so what he says is, don't worry about stuff. God will take care of you. And when you focus so much attention on material things and obtaining of material things, storing material things, then what you end up with is a problem of focus being misguided from the Lord. And so in this passage, for instance, he gives us 7 symptoms that we can look at or excuse me, 6 symptoms that we can look at for money sickness in our own hearts. For instance, he says, if you're boasting about it, the man got his wealth. He said, look at all the stuff I've got. Wealth gives him confidence and a sense of self-worth. And he wants to show you that by getting bigger barns. Like, I want to show you even more. For those that are boasting about it, what you see is you feel like your self-worth, your self-value is determined by how you compare to everyone else. James Carville, who's a political commentator, has once said that when you get to the top, your first inclination is to look around to see who else is there. It's inherently competitive in our country, and greed is that way. And so you boast about your money to give yourself more sense of accomplishment. Another thing that shows that we have too much worry about our possessions is worry. If you have money sickness, you're constantly worried about your future. What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? What are we going to happen in retirement? Do I have enough? Do I have enough? Am I able? Or you put yourself in situations that your money can't cover what you have. And so you're constantly worried about making ends meet. Another is money comfort. He thought to himself, it says in verse 17, he's talking to himself, comforting himself with what his money guarantees as safety. You have many goods. Life's going to be great. You've got everything you need. You take comfort in it. He's looking at feeling safe only because he's got enough money. Another symptom of money sickness is stinginess. He's multiplying his prosperity. He never thinks about how his money can be used for others. As a religious Jew, because that's the context, Jesus talking to Jews, and as a religious Jew, he was surely supposed to pay his tithe to the temple, but generosity was not the joy of his heart. We also see this overspending. I'll buy something. I'll get something new. I need something new. I need the newest thing. I need the latest thing. I know I have an iPhone 12, but I need an iPhone 13. I know I've got the latest Android phone, but I need the next one. I need that. I need it. It's what advertising is built on, this idea that we have to have it. And then the stockpiling, hoarding, if you will, or building up. And maybe not hoarding, but just building up more and more and more and more. And what we see in this whole thing is this man has an issue with money, with boasting about it, worrying about it, being comforted by it, being stingy with it, overspending and stockpiling. All of those are symptoms. And you may not have all of those in your life, but you may have some. Your church may not have all of those in your life, but you may have some. I've been a part of pastoring churches now for 20 years. And at various times within, there have been times when they've boasted about their money, what we have, well, the security we have in that. There's been days of worry because are we going to be able to pay the bills? Is that's going to happen? There's been stinginess about how we give that money out, how we send it, where we send it, what percentage we're sending out. There have been times of spending too much. There have been times of not spending enough. There have been times of stockpiling money and other things in order that we should be doing with that money should be doing other things like ministering. And so as we look through that, we ask the question, what's the proper response to money? And what he tells us in verse 20 and following gives us some of that answer. The first thing that we need to understand, if we're going to understand how to handle our money personally or in a church, is that we need to wake up to the brevity of life. He says, you fool, your life will be demanded of you tonight. None of us know how long we're going to live. None of us have any idea whether our life can be taken from us tomorrow. And the question we have to have is, where are we investing? Are we investing in the things of earth? Or are we investing in the things of eternity? Are we investing in things that will last? Or are we investing in things that will fade away? The old joke is that you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul, right? We're not taking anything with us. You can't take it with you. And what you build up on this earth when we die is gone. Recently, we had a man in our congregation die, and he was a man that collected lots of really cool things and had lots of great possessions. And when he died, they had an estate sale where his children didn't want any of it, and they sold every bit of it to new people. And I just thought about that in context of this, that those things that we build up on earth, that we invest in on earth, even if they're passed down generation to generation, they're worthless in the scope of eternity. Psalm 92, that we ought to think often about the brevity of life. Lord, teach us to number our days so we may apply our hearts to learn wisdom. We need to understand that life could be ending at any moment. We need to live with an eye on the future. The second thing we have in verse 21 is be rich towards God. In verse 33 continues, says, sell all of your possessions to the poor, make money bags so they won't grow old, exhaustible, where no thief can come and nothing can be taken away. A wasted life is a life that focuses all of our effort in our 70 or 80 years, whatever we're given, 20 years, 60 years, 100 years, and is focused on the things we have here and not on what God intends for us to have for eternity. There's a difference in a wasted life and a wisely lived one. And as we focus our attention more and more on what God has called us to do, we don't want to waste the time we have here. We want to become rich towards the things that matter, rich towards the things of God. We need to rethink and understand contentment. Contentment is the ability to be okay with what you have at all times. I think of Philippians chapter 4:13, one of the most misused verses in the Bible that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul is just in Philippians talked about all the different situations he's been. He's been rich, he's been poor, he's been out, he's had plenty and he's had nothing. He's been beaten and he's been well. But whatever situation he finds himself in, he can do it because of Christ who strengthens him. We don't need money, we don't need possessions, we don't need security for contentment. We have all of that contentment in Christ because what he has already done for us. On Wednesday nights here at the church, we're going through the book of Ephesians. And in the book of Ephesians, he spends the first 3 chapters reminding them, this is what you have in Christ. This is who you are in Christ. This is what Christ has done for you, to remind them to say, listen, you can be content no matter your situation. Paul's writing that from prison. He can say you can be content no matter your situation because of what you have in Christ. So we need to rethink and understand contentment. And then finally, alongside of that, we need to remember God's love. Remember that God has given us everything we need in Christ through our salvation. And so when you think about that personally, sometimes that's easy to think about personally, but the same must be said of the church. There are lots of churches even that invest in things that are temporal, that are here. They spend an inordinate amount of their budget on building maintenance. And buildings are important. Buildings are needed for gatherings, but when they become what you spend a majority of your budget on, you're spending it on finite temporal things instead of the things of eternity. And so over the course of this semester, we're going to talk about what it means to be good stewards of what God has entrusted to us, to be able to manage what God has given us in a way that brings glory to his name, that advances his kingdom above all, and that we do it in good proportion, things that are temporal versus eternal. Jesus said this rich fool thought he had it all figured out, and yet his life was demanded, and so he lost it all. My prayer for you is that you will not lose it all, but that you will be investing your life, your money, your possessions, your will, your thoughts in things that are eternal in nature. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us on this particular beginning to this course and to this Bible study. And I look forward to seeing you again next week.